Hey everyone, Beardo here, coming at you with a Minutia Minute, in which I am going to be talking about this little green guy right here. Yes, it's time for me to weigh in on the whole Star Wars Disney buyout that we all know about. It's all old news. It happened a whole 3 days ago, but I do want to weigh in on this. I didn't want to talk about it at the time because, you know, right when it happens, there's a lot of shock value. People have a lot of strong opinions, and yeah, you know, it's one of those, it's really hard to really discuss it intelligently. So I'm waiting till today, and now I feel like it's been long enough that I can really talk about it, but hopefully it's still kind of on your mind, so hopefully my perspective can lend some kind of perspective to yours. First I have to frame this a little bit, because your appreciation of Star Wars is really different depending on when you grew up, especially nowadays with the prequel trilogy and all of that. So I'm 27 years old, and when I first was introduced to Star Wars, I was about 4 years old. I saw it at a friend's house, and ironically, when I was 4 years old, I always thought that, like, if I saw a movie, I'd never have the chance to see that movie again, because there were just so many movies out there that how could I possibly ever run into the same one twice? Which is kind of funny because it's Star Wars. But literally, I went home after watching it and was so sad because I thought, I'm never going to be able to see this movie ever again. And then one other thing to mention with this is I was also watching this movie without permission, and so I wasn't courageous enough to tell my family that I had seen this movie at this friend's house, because it's like, oh no, because I'll get in trouble. Then, like, about a year passes, and I'm about 5 years old, and I remember asking my mom, like, hey, have you ever heard of a movie called Star Wars? And she literally laughed in my 5-year-old face. She's like, of course I've heard of Star Wars. And that got my interest piqued, because at this point, I didn't even know that there was more than one Star Wars movie. I just knew there was this great movie called Star Wars. I loved it, and I didn't know how to ever see it again. And that apparently piqued her interest as well, because the next thing we knew, I was getting to watch the first movie again. I think we rented it or something, and then eventually I started to see the other ones, but it was only in bits and pieces, like on TV and stuff like that. And then right around 1991 or 2, something like that, George Lucas re-released the movies on VHS, and there was a VHS set that came out. I couldn't convince my family to buy all 3 of them, but they did buy me the first one, and that was the first time I ever owned a copy of Star Wars. It was that classic sort of triangular logo Star Wars, not Star Wars A New Hope, not Star Wars Episode 4, but just that, you know, very 70s poster that just says Star Wars across the top. And the reason why this is important is because I grew up in an era after the movies had come out, but during the era that they weren't as pervasive in just like everyday media leading up to when the prequels came out. During the mid-'80s through the early '90s, there was pretty much a dead period. You didn't see Star Wars, it wasn't getting re-released, there weren't toys, there weren't books, there wasn't any kind of expanded universe, really. And then George Lucas re-released them on VHS, which is the set that I had gotten as a kid. And then all of a sudden, the books started coming out, the comic books started coming out, the action figures started getting, you know, put out again, and, you know, there was this little mini Star Wars fever that basically all kind of wrapped up with sort of Shadows of the Empire, which was sort of like this unofficial movie between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It had a soundtrack, a comic book, a novel, action figures, and everything except the actual movie. And ever since then, that would have been like 95, 96, and then ever since then, it's all been kind of leading up into the prequels. So as a kid, I grew up with rose-colored glasses, and, you know, it's like the originals are untouchable. They're this very single, solid thing. There's all this wonderful expanded universe stuff, and oh my god, George Lucas is going to make more movies, and I'm going to be alive to see it. So there was all of that going in, and I got wrapped up. I mean, let me tell you, I have read so much Star Wars expanded universe stuff, and not even a lot compared to some of you other Star Wars fans, but, you know, I started out by buying the books, and then buying more of the books, and maybe even just a few more of the books. And then I also bought some more books. And then, yep, you guessed it, more books that you can't even see because I've completely blocked the camera. And then, all of a sudden, things started slowly regressing. I started kind of losing interest, and that was because the Star Wars prequels started coming out. And, I liked them at first as a kid, not really knowing what good movie making was and things of that nature. And so I had sort of a phase where I was kind of all for it, and it's like, give him some time, they'll get better, whatever, yada yada yada. And then I kind of slowly realized as I got towards adulthood, those movies weren't getting any better. And then on top of that, the original movies were no longer going to be coming out. They released the special editions in 1997. And then George Lucas basically said, you're never going to get the original versions again. And then with every subsequent release on DVD or Blu-ray, he would change stuff around again. Now, the only Star Wars movies I own are these 3 DVDs. Star Wars Episode 4 New Hope, Star Wars Episode 5 Empire Strikes Back, and Star Wars Episode 6 Return of the Jedi. Now, what's particularly important about this set is, first of all, this is the 6th time I've paid to own Star Wars Episode 4. I got it, as a kid on VHS. In 1995, they released them one last time, which nobody knew what that meant at the time, but it's true, one last time. And I got the full set then I got the special edition. Then when he announced that he was never ever going to release them again, I went ahead and got the original set of Blu-rays and found out that they weren't on there. The originals weren't, just the special editions. And so I bought a deluxe VHS set that was widescreen. It had all 3 of the movies. It came out, basically it was the deluxe version I wanted as a young child but couldn't get. And then finally he's like, okay, I'll release the originals one last time on DVD in these sets. Now, basically that DVD is a bonus disc, and it's a port from the Laserdisc version, so the quality of picture is very much lacking. It's letterboxed to the point where if you watch it on a widescreen TV, it still has huge black bars on the top and bottom and on the sides because the aspect ratio is only in 4:3. It doesn't expand to 16:9. And that moment, buying these, made me so mad that pretty much I haven't watched Star Wars since then. And that brings us to today and this whole Disney buyout, yada yada yada. Now, I mean, everybody's talking about the huge news of they're making another Star Wars movie and it's not going to be George Lucas. Now, honestly, to me, that's kind of the small news. The bigger news is the fact that George Lucas sold the rights to these movies at all. When I was a kid, again, take my age into account. Some of you guys who are a little younger, this is going to have a little bit different perspective for you guys. But growing up, Star Wars was the movie that, Hollywood said would fail. George Lucas put out a successful hit while he was working on Star Wars, and so they're like, hey, we'll give you a little more money. And he's like, you know what, why don't I just take the rights to the movie? And Hollywood said, yeah, to go ahead and take them because we're never making another one of these crappy things again. And then, of course, next time, you turn around, George Lucas is in a position to sell the rights to those movies for $4 billion. That's sort of the great filmmaker's triumph. One of the most important moments in sort of independent filmmaking thinking of basically in the history of cinema. Star Wars is sort of the most important embodiment of the independent filmmakers' hopes and dreams and wishes, because Lucasfilm obviously became a huge company, and Lucas now has zillions and zillions of companies and dollars. So the fact that he sold those rights to Disney at all is kind of a huge upheaval. It's this moment where it's the end of an era, really. And, basically from 1977 up through today, we've been living in the Lucas Spielberg era of sort of big blockbuster movies and, that whole, Spielbergian style filmmaking. And, we've been getting further and further away from that and into this more sort of just over-the-top version of a blockbuster movie, I guess. Like Transformers would be a good example of that. So we've been drifting out of the Spielberg Lucas era, but now the fact that Lucas doesn't own his own movie anymore is kind of the nail in the coffin and the end of that era. So I think that's really important to note. On to my perspective now about the whole buyout and what this means for Star Wars Episode 7. Now, a lot of people, I'm sure, are freaking out about how, it's a very set series of movies and yada, yada, yada. Now, for me, I gotta say that this is not nearly as big of a deal as it might be to some of you guys. And again, this is an age thing, because when I was a kid, it was a very specific set of movies. Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. The prequels came along, and just because they were George Lucas, frankly, doesn't mean they were good. And as far as I was concerned, the mythos of this classic set of movies that was untouchable kind of went away at that point. So the fact that Disney's making another one, kind of isn't really a huge deal to me. And by the way, stick around here. I've been going for quite a while, but I actually have some comics to show at the end of this, so stay tuned. But anyway, the fact that Disney has the rights to these, honestly, I had 3 or 4 basic thoughts. We'll say 4. First one was, maybe someone else can do a better job with more Star Wars movies than George Lucas. That was kind of my sarcastic thought. My second thought was, hey, maybe they'll re-release the original movies again for a change, which I would love. Disney, please go do that. Hopefully they do, because George Lucas is the only reason they haven't. Question number 3, will Super Shadow still play a major part in these movies? And for those of you who get that joke, bravo. And if you don't, Google Super Shadow, because his website's awesome. And then, fourthly, what's going to happen to the comics? And this is going to be in part me showing off some Star Wars comics, but also me talking about why it's okay that they're making more Star Wars movies and that George Lucas is not going to be attached to them. Because Dark Horse currently has the rights to the Star Wars comics, and they've done a ton of books, and I'm going to show you some of them in a minute. And before that it was Marvel, but now that Marvel is owned by Disney, I would assume that Star Wars book rights are going to ultimately get, basically that all is going to start being published by Marvel again, which for me is really sad, because I feel like Dark Horse has done a great job with the comics and the expanded universe and all that stuff. So, anyway, on that note, let's turn it over to the comics for a little bit, shall we? I just picked some random books to kind of illustrate some of the things I want to talk about. So this is by no means even scratching the surface of my comic book Star Wars collection, but I couldn't make this video 5 hours long, so here we go. The Star Wars comic book world really kicked off in the newspaper strips and in Marvel Comics. It ran in the newspapers for many, many years. You can actually get those collected by Dark Horse now, which is really great. I recommend them. There are pretty fun stories in them. And then you get the Marvel comic book series. And I don't know how people feel about this series anymore, but I really, really loved the Marvel comic book series, and this is going to really get to the heart of what I'm trying to say by saying that it's okay that someone else is going to make a Star Wars movie besides George Lucas. And that is, after you get past the first few issues where basically it's an adaptation of the movie, it's the first 6, I only have a couple of those, you get into kind of like crazy territory. And it's because nobody knew what Star Wars was really going to turn out like, and it was all in George Lucas's head at that point. And since we've only ever gotten George Lucas's perspective, it's been a very, as big as his imagination is, it's a very small piece of what Star Wars really could be like. And we could see any number of, different iterations of what Star Wars is like. And for me, that just, enriches the universe and makes it more interesting. And, I would love to see someone else's take on that original story. And that's one of the reasons why I love these old Marvel books, despite what I'm assuming a lot of people don't like about them, actually, because they're really, really out there. As I said, nobody really knew what Star Wars was like. And so you ended up with weird things like this bunny rabbit fighter pilot and this, feather boa, harlot alien lady. It was really, really, really bizarre. And, pretty much the sky was the limit in these old books, and it just made it an absolute riot to read from month to month. I mean, you had your familiar Star Wars moments. You had some, great classic looking Star Wars stuff. I mean, this is kind of a famous, image of all of the main characters. And then you had, again, bizarre stuff like the rabbit pilot peeking in. And, I mean, he was a regular character in a lot of these books. I don't remember his name. There was a Don Quixote-like character. And, it was just a completely different flavor of science fiction that, in a lot of ways, Star Wars kind of embodies, but takes to another level. And then, Dark Horse Marvel kind of took that and ran with it and did just all kinds of bizarre, classic sci-fi kinds of stories with. And I think that was really, really fun. And, again, the point is, you're looking at the Star Wars universe from the perspective of someone who is not George Lucas, and so they have their own set of criteria of, what's a good science fiction this, what's a good fantasy that, and so you get just all these very interesting, very random ideas that all culminate in something that is just a little bit more rich, a little bit different, and all in all, just a lot of fun. After the Marvel books ended, there was a long pause before getting to the point where Dark Horse took over. As I said, there was a big dead zone between the mid-'80s and the early '90s where there was nothing Star Wars coming out. Now, the books started coming out and the comic books started coming out more or less at the same time, and the first really big one, and, Dark Horse was putting out a lot of stuff kind of at the same time, but I believe the very first one they put out, and I could be wrong, but it's one of the first, was Star Wars Dark Empire. And this is coming out of, we know the whole trilogy now, we know what the universe is like, and so things feel a lot more Star Wars-y, I guess, when you read the comic. However, this still took things in a new direction. You've got Dark Horse Comics, known for their horror publishing, had a huge success with their Aliens books, like Sam Keith was illustrating Alien for a while, and, they were known for this sort of horrific element, and so they brought that to Star Wars, and again, it's a great, great story that is something that George Lucas never could have come up with, because it's just not in his style of thinking. This is a lot more adult than George Lucas likes to make his movies and things like that. And so you get basically the story of Luke Skywalker turning to the dark side. And you can see here he's sort of illustrated as Darth Vader. There's some scary, sort of ghostly Luke Skywalkers going on. In the meantime, his friends are sort of trying to get him back. You've got the return of Boba Fett here. These are, again, early Boba Fett things going on. You've got the return of the Emperor as a clone, which was really gross, as you can see by the way it's illustrated here. This is illustrated by Cam Kennedy, who I've mentioned once or twice before. He illustrated an issue of Batman that I had talked about in my Modern Age History of Batman books. And eventually, basically through very dramatic upheaval, Luke is brought back. But he's brought back, and this is the end of this arc, but then it came back with Dark Empire 2. Now Luke's working for good, but at the same time, he's got this darkness within him, and you see that in the fact that he basically dresses like Darth Vader on the covers of a lot of these books. He didn't really dress quite that extremely in the book, but, again, it's sort of a symbol of, this dark history that he now has, and, Dark Horse basically continued to push the envelope, continuing through the rest of this Dark Empire series, as we concluded Dark Empire 2, which, here's issue 5, and then things wrapped up in issue 6. And then there were some loose ends they kind of tied up in Empire's End, which, wasn't the best. But nevertheless, again, you can see, this is only a few years after the end of Return of the Jedi, so in continuity, it's not completely dramatically in a different place. However, thematically, they still took it someplace really different, and again, someplace that George Lucas wouldn't have. Now, to expand on sort of the Dark Horse history of comics, around the same time, we also got to explore the early days. So you started seeing books like Tales of the Jedi, which, again, all these were basically mini-series. And they all kind of added up to a major story. So there's issue 1 of Tales of the Jedi, here's issue 1 of the Freed and Nad Uprising, issue 1 of Tales of the Jedi, Dark Lords of the Sith, which was kind of my favorite one, because by this time they were really getting into sort of a main core group of characters, and then some of them turning to the dark side, and the rest of them having to react. So it was the first sort of totally original Star Wars story that didn't have any of the original characters, but took some of the tropes of that and ran with it. And this is very experimental because George Lucas never dabbled in this old Republic Star Wars. This is before the prequels, remember, and so. This takes place probably 1,000 some odd years before the originals, maybe 5,000 or something. It's a long time. So they kind of had carte blanche, again, to kind of do their own thing. And, I mean, whether you like the stories or not, I personally love them. Look at the covers. You gotta love the covers for these early issues. Now, of course, they dabbled in sort of the classic era more during this time as well. You got into X-Wing Rogue Squadron, which followed sort of Wedge Antilles. There was sort of a corresponding book series with these. Again, all these are mini-series, but eventually they kind of were the equivalent of ongoings. And then that was kind of the end of the first era in Dark Horse comic books, because at that point, George Lucas had announced the prequels, and the prequels were starting to come out, and they relaunched the first ongoing Star Wars series, basically when the prequels hit, or leading into the prequels, much the way Marvel had done with the original Star Wars. Now, I don't actually have issue 1 of that series anymore. I didn't really enjoy that series as much. It was just kind of, ironically, by the time they started tying in to the prequel trilogy, those stories automatically just became less interesting because they had to kind of fit into the George Lucas mold. And all of a sudden there was just a huge lack of creativity. The strongest thing that came out of that series for me was the introduction of Quinlan Vos, which again is an original character in that George Lucas, universe, and you kind of got to see things again, branch out, and he was very much his own character. And even though he was sort of in this prequel trilogy universe, he sort of lent something a little bit more fresh to it than what sort of, frankly, George Lucas had given them to work with. And then after that, basically you get into episode 2, and basically everything became about the Clone Wars. And this was fun just because it was the story between episode 2 and episode 3, so it felt like you were getting kind of a serialized version of the whole Clone Wars from the beginning of it in episode 2, continuing in the comics for basically 3 straight years until episode 3 came out. This was probably the biggest highlight of all of the books that were coming out in the prequel trilogy. Not this specific book, but when it became Star Wars Republic and it turned into a Clone Wars comic. It even says right on the top there. Now, after the end of the prequel trilogy, Dark Horse was looking for sort of the next big direction to take it, and what they did was they launched a few simultaneous titles, a couple of which I started collecting and a couple which I ended up ultimately not collecting. They went very deep into the past. They went into sort of original trilogy territory. They went into a territory between episode 3 and episode 4. That series was called Dark Times. The one during the original trilogy, I think, was called Rebellion. And then they went way into the future. Now, I collected the ones way in the past and way in the future because Knights of the Old Republic was very much, again, going into that deep past that Dark Horse had done such a great job on with Tales of the Jedi. For that reason, it was really, really interesting. But even so, I only read this series for probably about 20 some odd issues or something like that, because it just felt, again, since George Lucas took the time to really establish all the details of the Jedi and the fact that they're like sort of these women-fearing men that are probably a little gay. Again, these characters kind of had to suddenly fit into that universe, and it became a lot less rich storytelling than you got with the old Tales of the Jedi in the early 90s. What I did end up latching onto much more was Star Wars Legacy, and this was basically the first time they took a jump into the territory of the future, which at the time was really only covered by the novels, some of which I showed you towards the beginning of this video. And the thing that was great about it, though, is it was further in the future than anywhere else had gone. And as you can see, it again is bringing back some of that darker edge. There's a lot more going on with the Sith, and it just made for some really, really rich, interesting storytelling. This, for me, was kind of the strongest series after the prequels, before basically I kind of sort of, again, I lost faith in Star Wars quite a bit, and I just kind of drifted off and started digging for my own thing. And the only series that's really piqued my interest since then, and I forgot to grab those out, I'm reaching in for them right now here, is the Dawn of the Jedi series. And that's just because, again, they're always looking for ways to go into areas that George Lucas hasn't covered yet, or someone else hasn't covered yet. And so, with the Dawn of the Jedi, you basically go as far back into the history before Jedi even exist. And as much as this series started out kind of lackluster for me, I did ultimately end up really enjoying what they've put out so far. And it just became a really interesting exercise in, what were these people like way back in the day? And since there's no predisposed notion of the way George Lucas thinks it should be, they've gone and done some really impressive, creative, and unique things with it that I don't think George Lucas, if he had mandated this or set something up in the movies, I don't think it would have been nearly as rich or different as this is. And I would love to see, the Dawns of the Jedi, or the Dark Empires, or the Legacies, or the Tales of the Jedi getting brought in to a movie format. And I'm not saying the specific stories, I'm saying the creativity that having a unique voice brings to works of fiction that just expand and enrich the original stories that, in this case, George Lucas came up with. So for me, it's not a big deal that Disney's going to make more Star Wars movies, because as far as having a unique set of movies, like I said, for me, that was really kind of went out the window with the prequel trilogy. And so for now, I would say that anything more is just something more and different. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all expanded universe anyway. Once you get outside of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And notice, I'm not saying Episode 4, 5, and 6. I'm saying Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. So there you go. That's my rant on Star Wars. I've been looking for an excuse to show off some Star Wars books for a while. This was a really good excuse to. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it educational and interesting and whatever. Feel free to comment below. I'd love to know what your perspective is on this subject. And until then, I will talk to you guys very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.